In 1453, the most heavily fortified city on earth had stood undefeated for over 1,000 years. Its walls had broken the Arabs, broken the Avars, broken the Vikings, broken the Crusaders. Generals across centuries had looked at Constantinople and turned back. But one army didn't turn back. They brought something no one had ever seen before, a cannon so large it took 60 oxen and 400 men just to move it across the landscape of Thrace. And in 53 days, they did what no army in 1,000 years had managed to do. They walked through the walls of the greatest city in the world. This is the story of the Ottoman war machine, the army that turned siege warfare into an art form and spent 2 centuries breaking walls that were supposed to be unbreakable. For most of human history, walls won wars. Not armies, not generals. Walls. If you held a fortified city, you could outlast almost any attacker. Besieging armies ran out of food. They got sick. Morale collapsed. Disease spread faster than orders, and winter came without mercy. The city just had to wait. This is why medieval warfare was dominated not by the glory of open battles, but by the grinding misery of sieges that lasted months, sometimes years. The siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade lasted 5 weeks. The siege of Acre stretched nearly 2 years. Some cities were besieged again and again across centuries and never taken at all. Walls were the ultimate military technology of their era. Stone, mortar, height, and time. That was all you needed. And then the Ottomans decided to solve the wall problem permanently. What made the Ottoman approach revolutionary wasn't just firepower. It was systems thinking. They looked at siege warfare as an engineering problem, not a bravery problem, not a prayer problem. And they built an entire military structure around solving it. They recruited the best engineers in the known world. They developed new artillery. They trained specialized corps. They even invented early forms of logistics planning, so massive armies of 100,000 men could be fed for months without collapse. By the time Mehmed II came to power in 1451, the Ottoman military wasn't just an army, it was a machine. The most sophisticated siege machine the world had ever built. And it had one target in mind. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. The eastern continuation of Rome itself. A city that had stood since 330 AD, over 1,100 years of continuous existence. Its defensive walls, the Theodosian walls, were considered the greatest fortification ever built by human hands. 3 layers deep, a moat in front, towers every 50 meters, some sections over 12 meters thick. Armies had broken against these walls for over 1,000 years. Arab armies, Avar armies, Bulgarian armies, Viking mercenaries in Byzantine service, Crusaders, rival emperors, all of them had stood before these walls and eventually withdrawn. But Mehmed had something no previous attacker had ever possessed. His name was Orban, and he was a cannon maker. Orban was a Hungarian engineer, some accounts say Romanian, who had first offered his remarkable skills to the Byzantines. The Emperor Constantine XI was interested, very interested. But the Byzantine treasury was nearly empty after decades of decline. They couldn't pay what Orban asked. So Orban went to the Ottomans. Mehmed didn't just hire him. He gave him unlimited resources. A full foundry at Edirne, a team of assistants, whatever he needed. What Orban built was something the world had never seen. A bronze cannon over 8 meters long, capable of firing stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. Each shot could not just crack stone, it could shatter walls that had been standing for centuries. When it was first test-fired outside Edirne, the sound reportedly terrified the surrounding villages. Livestock panicked. Women miscarried from the shockwave. Birds fell from the sky. And that was just the test. When the Ottoman army arrived at Constantinople in April 1453, they brought not one Orban cannon, but a battery of artillery. 69 guns in total, arranged in a semicircle around the city's weakest points. They dug in, established supply lines, cut off the city by sea with a fleet of naval vessels, and began the methodical, relentless, patient destruction of walls that had been called eternal for a millennium. The siege lasted 53 days. Every morning, the Ottoman cannons opened fire. The ground shook. The air tasted of sulfur. Stone dust filled the streets inside the walls. Every evening, Byzantine defenders rushed to the breach, filling gaps with timber, earth, barrels of dirt, anything to hold the line through the night. Every morning, the cannons fired again. It was a war of attrition, and the Byzantines simply could not win it. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI knew the mathematics of his situation. He had perhaps 7,000 defenders, possibly fewer. Mehmed commanded an army estimated between 60 and 80,000 soldiers, with tens of thousands more support troops. Constantine sent desperate messages to the west, to Pope Nicholas V in Rome, to Venice, to Genoa, to the kings of Hungary and Naples. Help was coming, he was promised. Help was on the way. Small forces arrived, ships with supplies, a few hundred Genoese soldiers under a commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who fought with remarkable skill and loyalty. But nothing close to what was needed. Nothing that could change the mathematics. Meanwhile, Mehmed executed one of the most audacious logistical maneuvers in military history. The Byzantines had stretched a heavy chain across the Golden Horn, the inlet forming the northern boundary of the city, blocking Ottoman ships from attacking from that side. Mehmed didn't try to break the chain. He moved his ships around it. Over the course of a single night in late April, Ottoman crews dragged 70 ships across a greased wooden road, over a hill, nearly a mile over land, and launched them into the Golden Horn on the other side of the chain. The Byzantines woke up to find enemy warships in waters they thought were completely secure. The psychological blow was immense. The walls were crumbling. The sea was compromised. The West was not coming in force. By late May, the Theodosian walls had been damaged in multiple sections. The defenders were rotating on almost no sleep. Food rationing had become severe. The Ottoman army, swelled by the promise of 3 days of permitted plunder, a standard military incentive of the era, was ferociously, almost terrifyingly motivated. On the night of May the 28th, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers hit the walls. First, the irregular troops, to tire the defenders. Then the elite Anatolian soldiers. And finally, at the moment of maximum exhaustion, the Janissaries, the finest infantry in the world. The Byzantines fought street by street, gate by gate, stone by stone. Constantine XI reportedly tore off his imperial insignia so he would not be taken alive as a prize, and charged into the fighting like a common soldier. His body was never found. By the morning of May the 29th, the flag of the Ottomans flew over Constantinople. A city that had never fallen, fell. The Roman Empire, which had begun in 27 BC, which had given the world its laws, its roads, its architecture, its very idea of civilization, ended on that morning. Not with a grand philosophical collapse, not with a final Senate speech, with a cannon and an engineer who just wanted to be paid properly.
But Constantinople wasn't a lucky victory. It was a demonstration of a system. The Ottoman military had been engineered, deliberately, methodically, for exactly this kind of warfare. And they proved it again and again across 2 centuries of expansion. Belgrade, Rhodes, Buda, Baghdad, Cairo, Tabriz. City after city fell to Ottoman siege tactics because the system behind those tactics was unlike anything their enemies possessed. 3 elements made that system work, and each one was revolutionary in its own right. The Janissaries were the elite infantry corps of the Ottoman army, and arguably the most professional standing army in the world at their peak. Unlike European knights, who were feudal levies and owed loyalty to local lords rather than any central authority, the Janissaries were completely different in their origins, their training, and their identity. They were recruited through the devshirme system, a practice in which Christian boys from the Balkans and Anatolia were taken by the state, converted to Islam, raised in Ottoman culture, and trained from childhood as soldiers. They had no families to return to, no local lords to serve, no competing loyalties. They were the Sultan's men, completely and absolutely. They were paid salaries year-round, not just during campaigns. They were housed in barracks rather than dispersed across the countryside. They were drilled constantly, and they were armed with the best weapons the Ottoman state could manufacture. In an era when most armies were seasonal, mercenary, and motivated primarily by the prospect of loot, the Janissaries were professionals. In siege warfare, where morale had to hold across weeks or months, where discipline under bombardment was essential, this made them almost uniquely effective. The Ottomans invested in military engineers the way modern states invest in weapons research programs. They didn't just use engineers, they attracted them, funded them, institutionalized their knowledge, and passed it down across generations. Tunnel warfare, digging beneath walls to collapse their foundations. Artillery positioning, calculating the optimal angles for maximum structural damage to stone. Pontoon bridges, allowing massive armies to cross rivers in days rather than weeks. The Ottomans didn't just employ these techniques, they refined them. They created manuals, they built institutions. The cannon that Orban built for Mehmed wasn't a one-time miracle. It was the product of a culture that had been systematically investing in military technology for generations. After Constantinople fell, Mehmed established the first state cannon foundry in Istanbul, ensuring that the technological advantage that had won him the city would continue to develop for future campaigns. And this is perhaps the most underappreciated advantage the Ottomans possessed. An army besieging a city cannot live off the land. It cannot raid and forage like a raiding party. It needs a continuous, organized supply of food, fodder for animals, arrows, gunpowder, replacement parts for artillery, medical support, and replacement troops for those lost to combat and disease. Most besieging armies in history destroyed themselves before they destroyed the city. They starved. They caught plague. Their supply chains collapsed under the weight of distance and time. The Ottomans solved that problem at a scale no previous empire had attempted. They built road networks specifically designed to support military campaigns. They established supply depots at regular intervals along their campaign routes. They developed a corps of specialists responsible for nothing except keeping the army fed and armed during a siege. When Mehmed arrived at Constantinople, his army was not hungry.
it was not short of powder. It was not about to mutiny over unpaid wages. It was patient, organized, sustained. And that patience, that organizational capacity to outlast the defenders, was as much a weapon as the cannons.
But no system lasts forever. The Ottomans met their limit twice, and both times it wasn't walls that stopped them. It was the edge of what even the best logistics system in the world could sustain. In 1529, Suleiman the Magnificent, arguably the greatest Ottoman sultan in history, the man who had extended Ottoman power from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from Algeria to Yemen, led his army to the gates of Vienna. It was the deepest the Ottomans had ever penetrated into the heart of Europe. Standing before Vienna, Suleiman looked at the prospect of a continent under Ottoman rule. But the siege failed, not because of Viennese heroism, though there was plenty of it. The supply lines had been stretched to their absolute mathematical maximum. The army had taken longer than planned to reach Vienna. Delays caused by flooded roads and unexpected resistance along the route had consumed precious campaign weeks. Autumn came early. Heavy rains turned the ground to mud. The great Ottoman heavy artillery, the weapons that had made the system unstoppable, had been left behind because the roads couldn't support them in time. Without the artillery, without the time, without the supply margin, Suleiman did something the Ottoman military had almost never done before. He withdrew. Vienna held, not because it was impregnable, but because the Ottoman system had finally reached the edge of its operational range. In 1683, the Ottomans tried again. Under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a massive Ottoman force, estimated at nearly 150,000 men, surrounded Vienna in what would become the last great Ottoman advance into Western Europe. For 2 months, the city held on by the thinnest of margins. The garrison was outnumbered, supplies were running short, the walls were being undermined by Ottoman tunnel teams. Entire sections had collapsed. The city was on the verge, days, perhaps hours, from surrender. Then, on the 12th of September 1683, the relief army arrived. A coalition of Polish, Austrian, and German forces, approximately 80,000 men in total, had assembled on the hills overlooking the Vienna basin. At their head was King John III Sobieski of Poland, commanding the largest cavalry force assembled in Europe in that century. What followed was one of the most dramatic cavalry charges in all of military history. 18,000 Polish hussar cavalry, the famed Winged Hussars, with their enormous feathered wings designed to terrify both enemy horses and enemy soldiers, swept down from the Kahlenberg Heights into the flank of the Ottoman encampment. The Ottoman camp was not prepared for an attack from that direction. Supply lines, tents, artillery parks, ammunition stores, all of it was exposed. The camp collapsed into chaos almost immediately. Kara Mustafa Pasha ordered a retreat that quickly became a rout. He was strangled by a bowstring in Belgrade 2 months later, on the Sultan's orders. The Ottomans never threatened Western Europe again. And even as Vienna was being defended, a deeper problem was developing, one that no cavalry charge could solve, and no logistical reform could reverse. By the late 17th century, European military innovation had begun to catch up with and then surpass the Ottomans. The Trace Italienne, a new style of fortress design with angled bastions and lower, wider walls specifically engineered to absorb cannon fire rather than shatter from it, had transformed European fortification. The very weapon the Ottomans had used to break walls for 2 centuries was now being countered by walls designed specifically to resist it. European armies were also developing new infantry tactics: the flintlock musket, bayonet formations, coordinated artillery and infantry movements.
The military revolution that had started in the early 17th century was accelerating. The Ottoman military, which had been the most innovative force in the world in the 15th century, had grown rigid. The Janissaries, who had once been the engine of Ottoman military power, had become a politically entrenched institution resistant to change. When sultans tried to reform the military, the Janissaries revolted. The machine that had broken every wall in the world began to slow down, and the walls it faced began to change faster than it could adapt.
History has a way of remembering the dramatic moments. The fall of Constantinople, the gates of Vienna, the cannon that shook birds from the sky over Edirne, the engineer named Orban who just wanted a salary commensurate with his talent. But what actually built the Ottoman military empire wasn't drama. It wasn't courage, though there was enormous courage. It wasn't destiny, though every dynasty believes in its own destiny. It was engineering, investment, systems thinking. The understanding that wars are not won by whoever prays hardest, or whoever has the most righteous cause, or whoever fights the bravest. Wars are won by whoever solves the logistical, technical, and organizational problems better than their opponent. Mehmed II didn't conquer Constantinople because he was braver than Constantine XI. Constantine died fighting. That takes more than bravery. Mehmed conquered it because he understood that the wall problem was an engineering problem, because he paid an engineer properly when the Byzantines could not, because he built a supply chain that could sustain a 60-day siege, because he trained a professional army that could maintain discipline and morale for 7 weeks while doing the unglamorous work of breaking walls. The walls of Constantinople didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because someone finally built something stronger. And the lesson of the Ottoman war machine isn't just a military lesson. It's a lesson about competitive advantage, about the difference between a temporary technological edge and a permanent institutional one, about what happens when the most innovative organization in the world stops innovating. The Ottomans built the greatest siege machine in history. And then, slowly, over generations, they stopped improving it. And the world, which had been terrified of them for 2 centuries, caught up. Every empire that ever fell because something changed that it refused to adapt to. The question isn't whether the world is changing around you. The question is whether you're building something stronger or defending something that's already starting to crack. Every empire that ever fell because something changed that it refused to adapt to. What's changing around you right now?